I talk about porn every day on my YouTube channel. I come from a very unique perspective, though. I don't have your brain, your science background, your degree. So I love that with you, we can really dial in on the science, like the neuroscience, the nerdy, geeky stuff. But you're able to articulate it in such a simple way that we can all, with little IQs, digest and understand.
Well, thank you, because I have worked hard to be able to do that. I have been a college professor for over 25 years. And so that is what I'm trying to do on YouTube, because there's so much awesome science out there, but it's not easy to digest. Actually, someone put a comment yesterday on my YouTube channel saying you can find, and they actually put links. You can find what she says here at the Mayo Clinic, here at Neuroscience. But then he wrote, just stick with her because she's so much easier to understand.
Amazing. Yeah. And that's probably why your channel, like we were talking before, has just blown up in the last, month or so, because your message is just resonating. I'm just so excited. So let's just jump in. I mean, there's no need to continue the small talk. So I think the first place I really want to start with you, and this is because, we have women that follow the show, not so much on YouTube, but on the audio side of things. I'd say about 30% women. Can you speak to, because it seems like obviously pornography is a male problem, and Wired for Intimacy. I don't know if you've read William Shutler's book, but he talks about some of the differences, how men are visually stimulated versus women more verbally. So can you speak kind of to the difference between the male and the female brain, and why does it appear that this is such a male problem, if that even is the case there?
Well, actually, so what the science shows is that when there's a few different aspects. Yes, men and women's brains are different in terms of size. Men's brains are larger, believe it or not, right? And in functioning and functionality. But, and I can come back to that if we want to talk about it. But what I think is more important is that the science behind pornography consumption, especially and specifically, shows that the impact on the brain is the same for men and women. So the way that it affects the brain is similar across both genders, which I do think, is probably an interesting finding for most people. But there's another caveat when it comes to addiction. And, addiction's a loaded word. And actually another person put on one of the comments saying, she doesn't use the word addiction, so it must not be real. Nobody wants an addiction. Nobody wants to admit they have an addiction. So I prefer to talk about it as a compulsive habit, or, like a habit that you want to get rid of. And the defining factor is you keep going back for more and more and more, even though it has negative consequences in your life and makes you feel bad and you don't want to do it anymore. That is the defining factor, no matter what we call it. But the science on addiction between men and women shows interesting findings in behavioral and in substance abuse addictions. Behavioral being pornography, being a behavioral addiction, shows that women are impacted more quickly when they are exposed. So in the exposure phase, their brains are actually impacted more quickly, but it takes greater levels of exposure for their brain to stabilize into an addiction. So speaking to why would women's brains possibly be impacted more is because on first exposure, their brains could be hooked greater than the male brain. And then they would have to watch more and more and more to get to that stabilization phase where men's might stabilize a little bit lower. The science behind addictions also shows that there's more withdrawals, and withdrawals are more stressful for women in substance abuse and behavioral addictions, and that they are more likely for relapse. So what that shows is that the combination of those two scientific studies, if we can kind of glean what that might mean for a woman who's been exposed to pornography, who has, and just going back for one more second too, just men and women, we know it's nature and nurture. So there's also genetic or familial predisposition in brains that are more likely to have an addiction or a compulsive behavior. So if a woman has the brain that is at risk and then she watches pornography, then her brain might be hooked on it more quickly. She has to watch more to be able to get the release that she wants for it to stabilize. And then it's harder for her to walk away. So even though the percentages are smaller, and I don't remember the date on this, but Pornhub reported that 23% of their users were female. And so that's it's a quarter, we'll say, but it's still a pretty small percentage when we're talking about billions of views. And we're talking about 75% of the billions of views are men. But it's likely that those women, their brains feel like they need to go back for more because it's really been latched onto that behavior for the dopamine release that they're looking for.
Now, speaking to the genetic component, because you said that there could perhaps be a chance where genetically she's just more predisposed to a potential addiction. Are there kind of early warning signs that male or female could look at? Just, hey, am I, like, obviously we know it's bad, we're going to address it, but just in the early stages, like, are there things even before consuming porn? Can we just kind of, are there signs that we can identify maybe from our family or in ourself that, hey, we're more likely to become addicted?
Yeah, absolutely. So the number one, and we'll go back to nature and nurture, but they go together. They're like so closely hand in hand when it comes to pornography and moving into a bigger category that some people might call sex addiction, which also some people might not like that, but it's actually been added to the international classification of diseases as a compulsive hypersexuality behavior. So basically, sex addiction, even though we're calling it compulsive hypersexuality disorder, is a real thing. And the number one way that manifests is pornography consumption for all brains, regardless of the gender. But so the number one factor for women is sexual abuse. Number one. And in my more traditional training, not my neuroscience training, but my training as a sexual addiction recovery coach through the American Academy of Sex Addiction Therapists, there, and I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but it is a huge percentage. It's in like the 90% that if a woman develops a long-term sexual addiction, there's sexual abuse at the core of that. So the way that falls back is that talking about nature and nurture, nature is the type of brain or genetic predisposition. And there's science that proves that for all addictions, brains are at risk because of the familial link. But then the nurture part is what that brain does in its environment. And so if someone suffers from sexual abuse, many times there's family trauma and dysfunction there in the first place, because we know that abuse is also passed down behaviorally because of their brains across generations. So that nature and nurture is very, very linked in my mind. But I just made a video on epigenetics, and epigenetics means above genetics. So my message to the world about all of this stuff is that you control your own destiny by how you use your brain on a daily basis. But the philosophy that I preach or I share with people and that I believe in is that we have to look back to the past just for a peek. For some people, it's a peek. For some people, it's more of a dive and a dig. Then we spend much of our time in the present seeing how past behaviors and our brain performance pattern inform how we're living our life and the behaviors that we have. And then our brain needs to be modified and rewired, and our behaviors. And the best way to do that is to look forward, create goals with intention, anchor in, pull yourself towards the future while you're pushing yourself away from the past. And that's rewiring your brain the genetic way it was born, the way you've been using it, using your health, your wellness, your thought processes, figuring out your emotions, not being scared of them, and learning to identify and to be with them and not let them make you run and want to escape. That's epigenetics. And epigenetics includes what we think of as like alternative medicine, anything like an alternative and complementary medicine, which neurofeedback, what I try to share with the world, is part of.
Yeah, I love that. And we touched on trauma on episode 1. So for you guys that are hearing Trish for the first time on the podcast, when you're done with today, make sure to go back and listen to our first one, the neuroscience of porn addiction, episode 46, 47. I believe I'll link it in the show notes. But staying on that kind of working through and processing the past in the trauma, because I get a chance, I'll talk with guys. I mean, 20 consults a week or whatnot, guys reaching out, asking for help, seeking guidance, consultations and whatnot. And I always address that kind of, hey, have you kind of gotten to the root cause of this? And like, oh, I don't have any trauma. It's like, nope. Let's go a little bit deeper there. Can you kind of speak to, how perhaps, if not processing the trauma, if not actually getting to the root, like I got to imagine that trauma, it's stored sometimes unconsciously in the brain. Like there's a spot in the brain where it's hitting. So if we don't actually process that and we just leave it there and pretend that it doesn't exist, can that impact us from not being able to fully unwire and rewire, using kind of your terminology? And what can we do?
100%. And so the way that I think about that is that trauma locks the brain down. So the easiest way to conceptualize it is it creates a rigid brain. And we know that the way that brains change the best is when a brain is neuroplastic, when it's as flexible as possible. So trauma locks up the brain and creates a rigidity that makes it so that it's just so jammed in the neural pathways that were formed so long ago and have been traversed so many times through the old feelings and thoughts and habits and routines and lack of emotion. So the first question that I ask people when I do a consultation is, what's the primary stressor in your life? And the reason being is it's exact same philosophy you have and approach. When a person comes back and says, I have to get a lot of things done quickly and I have to interact with a lot of people who have different personalities and stress me out, that can give me a really quick picture of how that person's using their brain on a daily basis, which is a manifestation of that rigid pattern that they locked in a long time ago. I'll talk to another man and he'll say, I can't get out of my bed. I'm literally paralyzed here. I can't get out. And what I say to both of them is, your behaviors are your choices. I know you don't want to hear this, but I know you don't think you're choosing to stay in your bed all the time. And I know you don't think you're choosing to be all stressed out all the time. Those are choices. And you can choose again using epigenetics above it. And I break down what they could do instead. And they'll look at me like it's the most mind-boggling thing. But the power of it is, if I dig a little deeper, it likely goes back to what the trauma or the experience that they had when they were young, because our behaviors are the way that we act in the world to make our nervous systems feel comfortable. And I'm always talking about calm focus. We do different things to calm ourselves down, pornography being one of them for the people who are hooked on it, but also like maintaining a super stressy life could actually be a compensatory strategy for trying to make their nervous system feel okay through the chaos. So that's how I think about how someone's performing in the present. And then of course I ask them, like, what happened? What are some things in your life? And usually they're pretty linked up.
I love that you dropped your choices or your decisions, because I think, extreme ownership, taking responsibility for our actions, where it's got to us, and ultimately the responsibility that we're the ones that are going to get us out of it. I mean, that is the first principle of success, whether you're trying to overcome this or trying to achieve anything in life. So speaking to that, do you have like brain hacks? I mean, I guess it wouldn't really be a hack, but like, how do you get across to that guy that's like, can't get out of bed, or you're like, I can't get up in the morning to start my day. I got to hit snooze, 27 times or whatever. Like, how do you kind of speak from a neuroscientist or
very,
coach?
very specific actionable steps. And And that's what people say. I love your coaching because you actually give me something to do.
Yeah.
So when a person can't get out of bed, actually, one person or actually many people have difficulty getting out of bed because they want to watch pornography and masturbate. So I'm like, put your sneakers next to the bed, put your gym clothes directly next to the bed, and you're going to have to, it's not going to come with ease, but to pattern interrupt, to break the pattern, you have to have something immediately that is going to give you a dopamine release. So for the people who like to run, that's okay. For the people who don't, like, and my husband and I joke that the only reason we get out of bed is because we like to hang out and have coffee together. It's like a major motivator for us because as soon as our kids are up, there's no private time. So like for us to hang out, to have like half hour silence in the house, it's such a strong motivator to get out of bed. You need a motivator that gives your brain what it needs to be able to pattern interrupt. And a lot of people don't have that. And it all goes back to neurochemical release that, you need to find what gives you that. That's why I try to create goals that are on purpose. And I'm always talking about creating purpose in your work, in your relationships, and in your hobbies or your play. So you can get up and engage right in your work if that's something that feels good. In like for me, that would be like a hobby or downtime in my relationship, because that's a really good time for my relationship. But it's so motivating because it gives my brain exactly what I need. And
I
so I
love
give people very specific strategies, and then when I talk to them again, I say, "How did it go?" And if
follow up on
they
it.
did
Yeah.
them, their lives and brains are in a different place. And so just to go back for 1 second, talking about the rigid brain pattern, and you had asked like what does trauma do to the brain, and then what can we do about it? The goal is to make your brain more plastic by unjamming that rigidity. So that's why changing routines, habits, behaviors, thought processes, emotions is crucial. And then of course, my framework is get the brain training headband, which I don't own the company. I wish I do. It's called Muse. But people can get a 15% discount through me because I'm a Muse ambassador. But if I tell people, you don't want to work with me, just get the headband, because it's going to start pattern interrupting the pattern that you're wiring into your brain every day. The headband pulls your brain out of anxiety mode, out of overwhelm mode on a daily basis if you use it, and it will pull your brain into calm focus. So that's rewiring your brain from the brain down to the mind and the body. All of those behavioral things like thoughts and all that behaviors, that is rewiring your brain from your mind and your body up. That's a comprehensive plan. And so I talked to a young man the other day, and he's like, I keep relapsing, or everybody says this to me actually. I keep relapsing. What can I do? I say, what changes have you made in your life? And they're like, well, I'm trying not to relapse. I'm like, you can't change that behavior within the same system. You have to change the system.
I want to make today's conversation around the topic of erectile dysfunction, more specifically porn-induced erectile dysfunction. So maybe to kind of kick it off, I mean, you made this massive segue, I think, in your content, in your work, specifically diving deeper into these topics. What was kind of the genesis for you to really plant your flag deeply and really make this a theme of kind of the work that you're doing right now?
Yeah, well, I realized from all the clients I work with that I call it sexual arousal dysfunction, SAD, because it makes it easier to talk about. And it includes erectile dysfunction, delayed ejaculation mostly, but premature ejaculation has a different neural mechanism, but kind of I chunk it into SAD, sexual arousal dysfunction. And it's the number one thing that people who at least seek out my neuroscience based help, it's the major motivational factor. So I realized it because all my clients had erectile dysfunction. I'm like, this is what I need to tell people because I'm on a mission to help people heal their brains and make their lives better. So there are literally millions of men who are struggling with some level of sexual arousal dysfunction, from full ED to, having difficulty being with a partner. And if they are watching porn and it's in the mix, it is a factor that needs to be dealt with. And it's likely the factor that will help them heal quickly. But that being said, then when I go, you got to quit porn, my friend, that's a whole nother, ball of wax to have to deal with, because it's not that easy. So I really want people in the world to know, if you're struggling with sexual arousal dysfunction with a partner, porn's at the core of it. Many of the people I work with, they're 20, 21, 22. A lot of people think a big myth is that it's age related. It's brain related. So I want people to know that.
Yeah, I was doing a lot of research and preparation for today's conversation. I stumbled across various numbers and research and data out there. I think the most common number I see is around 26% of men under the age of 40 are struggling with some form of ED. Is that number close to kind of your?
I would say 26% of men who are willing to admit it in a research study. So the number is completely different. So, that's a number that's out there, but all the people that I talk to have not told anybody, haven't told their partner. They've not told anybody. So when it comes to the work that we do, it breeds in secrecy. So people struggle for so long because they don't want to admit they have a problem and they don't know what to do to get the right help.
Yeah, I love that you put that caveat, right? The number of men that would actually be willing to acknowledge this in a research study. I think the same as just with porn use. There's different studies out there that 70% of men consume it on a monthly basis. Well, those are the ones that are going to admit it, because they're worried about their wife, maybe, seeing them while they're checking that box on a research study. Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Now, in the past, I do think that this was something that was age related, right? As men age, our testosterone numbers decline. You get into your 40s, you get into your 50s. I think 80s, 90s growing up, like that was what we maybe saw our fathers or maybe our grandfathers struggling with it. Today, it's like you said, it's the men in their 20s.
It's not just totally testosterone driven too. Like from I always bring it back to the brain, which your brain runs your body and your mind. People forget that. They lose sight of that. But, as we get older, our systems get older too. Our brains get older. So what happens is a lot of times, and there's a lot of research that shows like at a cellular level, we're aging. So our brain and our cells no longer have healthy baseline arousal. And testosterone plays one piece of that. So do other hormones and neurotransmitters. But long story short, it's like as we age, our systems are getting older, our baseline arousal changes. So our baseline arousal, we'll just say it's older, and so it changes the way that then you can reach sexual arousal. It's more difficult in an aging brain, historically speaking. But now, for all intents and purposes, we can just say that like porn is prematurely aging people's brains by putting it into this dysfunctional pattern of autonomic nervous system dysfunction, changing baseline arousal. So a huge thing I want people to know is when we talk about sexual arousal dysfunction, it is a product of a dysregulated baseline arousal in your brain and your nervous system. Your baseline arousal has changed, and I can explain that a lot more.
Yeah. Let's get really nerdy here if we can on some of this, right? I think you're the you're the expert and the ideal person to have on. So at a mechanistic level, right? Kind of like from the neurology, from the physiology, what is taking place, that's leading men to having these issues?
Sure. So the easiest way to understand it, or that at least I think, and I talk about it, is that porn's known to be a supernormal stimulus. What supernormal means is that it basically produces higher levels of dopamine in the nervous system, in the brain, when it's exposed to pornography. And of course, we have to acknowledge the fact that most people are consuming porn for the first time in adolescence. So now we have an underdeveloped, a not fully developed brain being exposed to very high levels of dopamine. I call that the seeds of addiction. So they're kind of planted in adolescence. So if you water those seeds frequently, consistently, and especially with increasing levels of intensity, which this is all supported by science, then what happens is your brain basically recalibrates itself and it needs the higher levels of dopamine to feel pleasure. So the reason that happens is because of desensitization of the D2 dopamine receptors in the reward center in the midbrain. So, I liken it to donuts in your brain. Like if you've ever done a donut in your car, and, I've only done one on accident, but my best friend's son, he's in a car club where they go behind, it's like so terrible, but whatever, they go behind like different buildings at night. And some of the kids will even rent like U-Hauls and cars, and because they'll go behind the buildings and do donuts, donut. And it just fries the tread on the tires. And so then the tires are completely worn down. So if you keep going back to porn, you're basically doing donuts in the brain and you are just detreading the dopamine receptors. So what that means is then Now you go to try to be with your partner and you can't because you need very high levels of dopamine that a sexual experience with a healthy, actual human being partner can't provide. And another easy way to think about it is like porn is a level 15 on a 1 to 10 scale of mental and physical stimulation that equals high levels of dopamine. 15 on a 1 to 10 scale. So you go to be with your partner on a good day, she or he is a 9, right? Like who's a 10? And on a bad day, your partner is like a 4. So now you need level 15 and you're getting level 7. So basically, you have an 8-point spread between what your brain needs to be aroused and what you have in your life. But that gap can be closed when people stop watching pornography. Their brain will recalibrate through the beauties of neuroplasticity to not need the high level of dopamine anymore. And then what I help people do is rewire their brains back to as close to optimal. And then when they do that, then they can enjoy healthy sexuality again from a baseline arousal of 5 in the middle of 1 to 10. If you're 1, you're depressed. If you're 5, you have calm focus. If you're 10, you're really jazzed up and excited.
Yeah, I love that. And we're definitely going to get into some of the weeds and the tactics and strategies that can help kind of reset some of these baselines. I love the analogy you gave there with the tires, right? I grew up in the Fast and Furious generation. That movie came out when I was originally in high school.
What do you mean? There's like 12 of them now. It's everybody's generation.
Well, I say the Fast and Furious generation because the original one, right? The one was actually like a good movie that you want to sit down and watch. It's become so commercialized now. But anyways, I have a lot of experience behind the buildings, doing the donuts. Like we did all that stuff back in the day. I think one of the things that has enabled us to become successful is helping men reframe their pornography use as, I don't often see it as a sexual behavior. I think most of the men that I've experienced and worked with use it as a stress relief. There's a high arousal, right? A high stimulus, something at work. Oftentimes it's financial stress because we work with a lot of high performing men, and then porn becomes the stress reliever, right? It's a lever that you pull to calm yourself down. When you think about being intimate or having sex with your wife or your partner, you're usually not doing those in moments of high stress. So once they understand that they're actually not doing it out of sexual arousal, they're doing it out of autonomic deregulation, then they're like, oh, it clicks now, right? So how does this kind of play into, the understanding or the link between the erectile dysfunction and the use of porn?
Yeah, totally. So that's the way I talk about it too. I call it mood regulation. So like you're going to porn or hypersexuality for mood regulation. Number 1, stress reduction. And this is what science shows. Number 2, which is actually quite far behind stress reduction, is boredom, offsetting boredom, which I would contend is not boredom at all. It's lack of overstimulation. Because people aren't bored at all these days. They're just not overly stimulated. So like that's a really important distinction to make because people are like, I'm bored. And I'll be like, are you? You're just not hyper stimulated right now. You're not on your phone watching a show, having, the ticker of the stocks over there and having 3 people talk to you. Like we live in the generation of just massive overstimulation. So stress reduction, offset boredom, which is actually lack of overstimulation. So it's mood regulation. And sometimes people do use their partners for mood regulation. So if you're out there listening and you're like, you realize that a lot of times what partners will do is they'll try to have sex with their wife, like first thing in the morning or in the middle of the night. And like, it's not a time when you would be actually like wanting to have sex for connected, pleasure, joy, and connection. That's the happiness trifecta out of healthy dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. You realize like you're trying to get a big dopamine hit because it's Monday morning and you've got to make your way through a week. So the idea is like if you're going to sexuality, whatever it might be, but primarily porn for mood regulation, all this stuff is logical when you think about it. If you're going to it for mood regulation, then you have dysregulated mood. Your mood is the thing that is at the core. And then to me, mood is a byproduct of brain performance patterns. And again, all proven by science. So anxiety is a dysregulated brain pattern. It's a brain that's running too hot, too fast. Stress. Feeling bored is a brain that's running too slow. You need some stimulation. So basically, porn becomes a self-medication for bringing your brain down or up or both simultaneously. So when people figure out that, yeah, they are using it in that way, then they will be inspired to leave porn behind. But again, just think about what I just said. If your brain's running too fast and it's running too slow, that's changes in baseline arousal. You're up at 10, you're down at 1 simultaneously, or you're swinging between the two. So I've started to talk about them as strained brain, where you're gassing and braking at the same time. And a lot of people can feel that in their brains, or pendulum effect. You're super stressed, then you're exhausted and overwhelmed. Then you're ramped up again, then you're beat again. You're swinging that pendulum back and forth. That is the mood dysregulation that requires something to self-soothe or self-stimulate. So if your brain's not doing that, you don't need anything to self-soothe or self-stimulate. Plus, when you bring your brain back to the middle, you now have healthy baseline arousal. You no longer have erectile dysfunction or SAD.
God, wow. As you're explaining that pendulum swinging back and forth, like I'm just replaying like my mid to late 20s and early 30s. Like that was my experience. And like I would chase these things. Like I would chase the high knowing that a couple hours later it was going to be a low. And then in that low, well, okay, I'm going to get myself out of it. I would do it with caffeine. I would do it with food. As a competitive bodybuilder, I would do it with training and high stimulants. And then it got into parties and then drinking and then the weekends. And then your days just become this pendulum swinging back and forth. I mean, I doubt that there's research that supports this, but what percentage of people today, because you said it, nobody knows how to be bored anymore. Like growing up, we had to sit in a waiting room sometimes and stare at the CNN playing or maybe read a Nature magazine. Today, you have something that can keep you entertained 24 hours a day around the clock. That wasn't even be boredom back then, but you and I probably experienced real boredom growing up. And
I love it. I think it's great. And we
well,
still
forces
do it
creativity, right?
In my family, like we'll pull the kids out, which now they're in their 20s and late teens, and we just sit around doing nothing, which I love that because I don't think any people do that, nor do families. It ends up in like weirdness and laughter, and an hour of doing nothing like brings the nervous system down. But yeah, and I was talking to my son the other day, he's 20, and I said, gone are the days where cartoons were only on Saturday morning. Like you got up, he's like, what do you mean? I had to explain it to him. I'm like, there wasn't content everywhere 24/7. You could only watch cartoons at 8 a.m. on Saturday. So every kid was up at 8 a.m. on Saturday, glued to the TV. It was like the only time that, so that built anticipation, and all the other times you weren't connected to the screen. There's a lot of research coming out right now that just shows that a few things it shows is everybody's basically becoming more dysregulated because of screen time. It wires and tires you. Wire and tire is the strain brain. It's the pendulum effect, too fast, too slow, wired and tired. And it's creating dopamine dependencies of all different types in social media, in sexual media, pornography, short form. We know short form media, it's getting shorter and shorter and shorter. like, come on, attention spans are decreasing where you can't even watch something for 2 minutes anymore. Now it can only be under a minute. So that's very dysregulating to brains, and people are going to have more issues than ever before. But one other thing is that I find interesting and terrifying is that for the first time ever, the younger generation is worse off mentally and physically than the generation before. Until this time in history, it always was the younger generation was better off mentally and physically. And now that we add electronics and screen time and screen brain into the mix, worse off physically and mentally.
Yeah, and financial as well, and those are byproducts of probably being mentally and physically less off. You mentioned at the beginning that early exposure was a precursor to this ED. Same with addiction, right? I'm sure you've seen this in your work. The data supports it. The earlier age that you are exposed to it, the higher probability you'll be addicted later on in life. What are some of the other maybe predetermining? Because I doubt every guy that watches porn or even has a compulsive behavior with it struggles with the ED. So what are some of the pre-lining conditions?
Age of exposure is really only one element. And honestly, I wouldn't even put it at the top. Not that I've ever scientifically ranked these, but I would not put it at the number one. The number one thing that I would say is basically quantity and quality, meaning the amount of porn consumption. And that can be frequency, consistency, the length of porn sessions. And the number one thing is edging, where it's you keep going back, but you don't allow yourself to go to orgasm. What you're doing is lingering very high levels of dopamine, just like donuts in the brain. All like you can walk away and internalize this. This is the challenging part. It can become internalized. So for a person who is edging, let's just say they got 50 tabs open and they're going from intense, trying to find the perfect thing with the high level of intensity, that is going to just keep increasing, hitting the dopamine button, keeping it flooding that reward center, desensitizing those dopamine receptors. So for the people who I work with, those who have been caught up in that aspect generally are the worse off in terms of functioning. They will feel terrible in their brain fog, lack of motivation, difficulty focusing. Again, they can internalize the dopamine cycle, so they don't even need porn anymore. Like one gentleman, just an example that I work with, all day long at work, he can run reels in his head. Like he's flooding his system with dopamine, and it basically has hit a level of automaticity that is making it so that he can hardly turn it off. But he can barely work now because he can't think. He feels depressed. He feels anxious, like strain brain all day long.
Is there an analysis that a guy can kind of run him through, because I doubt that you can go into a doctor's office and say, hey, I think I have porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Obviously, reach out to somebody like yourself, contact us here. We can kind of help you in the recovery. But the guy sitting on the fence, he's like, man, Trish, some of these things you're saying are kind of hitting me, right? I got exposed early on. I've noticed that the quantity and the severity or the quality is maybe not the best word there, but I think people understand what we're talking about there, the intensity of it. And then they're doing the edging stuff. Like, so he's kind of assessing this, like what signs, physical symptoms can maybe he look for within himself?
Yeah, definitely. Well, first thing I want people to know is that I can see it in people's brains. So when people work with me, I do something called a QEEG brain assessment. And
QEEG?
QEEG. It's called quantitative electroencephalogram. Like most people know what EEG, if you've had a sleep study, an EKG, echocardiogram, measures your heart. So I do something called EEG, and I work with people all over the world. So we call it a brain map. It's easy to call it a brain map. Basically, I can map your brain. I can just see it in your brain, and I can see the levels too. So the level of dysfunction is a product of how you use your brain. So it could be early exposure. It could just be, frequency and consistency. It can be intensity. And an interesting thing too, which is a little bit of a digressing, is that what happens for many people is there can be a straw that breaks the camel's back then. So for a lot of people I work with, they'll go, I quit porn like 2 years ago, but it can tip over because of a lot of exposure or lots of little things, even like objectifying people or fantasy or masturbation. Nobody wants to give up masturbation, but it's linked to that internalized dopamine cycle. So in the brain map, I can see if they have the brain pattern of ED, and if so, to what level. So that's an easy way to quantify it, and so that's a top tier service. But what I've done now, I just started a program that is very affordable, that uses technology. It uses the brain training headband that I use in my work, but it's a monthly community where now on this headband, it's on my website if anybody cares. And this isn't the sales part. This is how I help people understand this, is that I have it buried at the bottom of my website. It says brain training headband, but it gives you a graph of how your brain is performing using the different bandwidths of electrical energy. So on any given day, you can see if your brain is wired or tired. So it's pretty cool because it's an entry level way to introduce the idea of healing your brain using technology. But anyways, like, what happens for most people I work with is they're approaching this from a bottom up approach. So I want people to know that's a slow approach, like figuring out what your symptoms are. If you have difficulty being aroused with your partner, you know it, and you have performance anxiety. Performance anxiety makes that brain pattern worse. Going back to the logical part, if the arousal dysfunction comes out of a brain that's stressed and too fast, and also running too slow, then when you get stressed about how you're going to perform with your partner, this goes up and it keeps reinforcing that arousal dysfunction. That I think is the most tragic part of this, is that It's very difficult to get out of because basically you're using neuroplasticity in the wrong direction. You're creating a negative feedback loop. And we can talk more about that in a second. But so, symptoms are going to be, you might be able to be aroused by porn. Some people reach a point where even porn doesn't get them aroused anymore. You have high levels of dysfunction if you can't be aroused by porn anymore, because level 15 doesn't do it for you anymore. And you're out of levels because your dopamine receptors are so desensitized. So it might be that you can get aroused by porn. It might not. It usually means that either you have ED and you can't be with your partner, or you have SAD, sexual arousal dysfunction, where you can kind of sort of be with your partner. It's not working that great, and it's taken a long time, and nobody's having a good time, and it's difficulty to have that experience. And, yesterday I talked to one of my clients. He's like, I've lost 3 relationships because of this. So like, if you're trying to find a partner and you're not able to, because first of all, you're too anxious to even try to be with a partner. Secondarily, when you try, it doesn't work. Like, the symptoms are there. I don't even have to explain them to people. They know what they're struggling with. What I want them to know is that is a bottom-up approach. It's happening because of your brain, not because of your body. Your brain runs your mind and your body. Your brain is the thing that's giving you performance anxiety. Your brain is the thing that's making it so that your sex organs don't become aroused. So I want people to know you can definitively see it in technology that's pretty affordable these days.
I'm really curious as to, with the brain, there's an infinite amount of areas that you could have gone to study and work. And I mean, even like you were telling me, I mean, prior to what you're doing now, you kind of had it made, for lack of a better term, sit back, just kind of chill, not a whole lot of work, and just rolling in the cash. But what was really for you, what kind of led you into working with porn, and yeah, just kind of, what's led us to where this is what you're, as you called it, your passion project right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I call it my passion project. And there's really 2 reasons. One is for the sake of other people and society in general, which I will explain in 1 second, because that's the larger reason. But really for me, why me specifically is drawn to this is, what I'm getting out of it personally is the way that my brain works is I really love niche types of concepts that go back to brain performance, cognition, thinking, that psychological and emotional aspect, and how that plays out in behaviors of people's minds and bodies. And literally pornography use and a habit and addiction, when people are able to acknowledge that they are at the level of addiction, is the perfect storm of all of those aspects. It is a brain performance pattern that is led awry by a supernormal stimulus on an electronic device that's resonating at the perfect frequency to calm and stimulate a brain. And what I try to communicate to, it's mostly men and that are affected, is that it would be almost impossible to resist it because it is such a supernormal stimulus. And especially if you have those needs in your brain to be calmed and to be stimulated, it takes you, and I always say it takes 2 times to be hooked. It literally only takes 1 time. But the second time you go back, it's the slippery slope, as I call it. So for me, my life has transitioned basically every 7 years. I'm like my husband's like, why you got to change again? And I'm like, dude, I don't know what to tell you. My life happens in 7-year chapters, and we've been together 20 years. I'm like, you know me. It's like, but it always is developing out of what I've done and where I feel like I'm being drawn, and where my gifts and my expertise and my love for learning more and more can be used to help people. And that's the healthiest version of me. Learn about something that's incredible and then be able to help so many people with that knowledge. And I literally feel like I'm the 1%, and you might be the other, person in that 1% with me that knows about this. And so I can't sit with that. I have to let everybody else know.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, for me, I know firsthand from, living with it, what it feels like. So I've gone through the transformation, and I've understand once you break free, how freeing it is. And then when you really kind of get clear, I mean, I thought I was focused and,
successful and creative prior to this, but like when I was able to, that kind of 90-day reboot period, which I'd love to kind of get your take on the time frame later on. Like it's
that's
like
always the hardest question. Let's save that one for a little, because people ask me the number one comment, how long is it going to take me? It's like there's so many variables, but we can definitely
exactly, yeah. But one thing you said there is you said it only takes 1 or 2 times if you have that in your brain. So question, are there brain types? I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it, but are there specific development of the brain or the specific way the brain is, wired that makes somebody more susceptible to a pornography addiction?
Yeah, and scientific.
How can you know if that is you, if it's even possible?
Yeah, I can know. Most people can't, but the beauty of it is I use technology that's called EEG, electroencephalogram. So most people know, if you've gone for life insurance, you have to have an EKG of your heart. It measures how your heart is using electrical energy. EEG measures how your brain is using electrical energy. So the evaluation that I perform is called acute EEG, quantitative, meaning measurable. So what I love people to know is everything I do is measurable. I can measure it all. So it's amazing. It's awesome. So the first thing, and we just call it a brain map. It's a acute EEG brain map. But basically, there are brain performance patterns. That's how I talk about it. Instead of brain types, they're performance patterns. Okay. There's brain performance patterns that people use. There's all different types, but there's an optimal type. So for every age and gender, there's an optimal way of using electrical energy in your brain. And the really quick version of it is there's basically 5 speeds that your brain should be able to transition in and out of across your day. And they're so logical to think about. So I usually start like in the evening when you're feeling groggy and tired, your brain's starting to make more slow speed. And it's called theta. Then when you shift into sleep, you're using more of extra slow speed. It's called delta. Then you sleep all night long, you get a glorious 8 hours of sleep, which usually never happens for most people. But when you wake up and you're feeling groggy again, you're coming out of delta back into theta, slow speed. Then when you're chilling, you're having a cup of coffee, you're using alpha medium speed. That's couch mode, as I call it. That's relaxation mode. A little bit faster is fast speed. And I always probably incorrectly characterize it as perfect processing speed, but it helps people to understand. Low beta is perfect processing speed for being in the zone, for being in flow. I'll talk about flow in a minute because it's one of my favorite concepts ever that is destroyed by pornography.
Yeah, watch that video.
Destroys flow. So what happens is when your brain is using low beta, you're in the zone, you're calm and you're focused and you're present and you're producing, you're creative, you can stay on topic and you can get your best work done. Then anxiety mode is extra fast. It's high beta. Your brain's cranking away so fast that it'll get away from you and it needs to be calmed down. So that's the quick and dirty of how optimally your brain should be able to shift in and out of that as needed. If someone jumps in right now and startles me, my system's going to kick it into extra high and I'm going to run. I'm going to fight or flight. But then when I realize it's just someone scaring me, I'm going to come back down. I'll be in low beta. I can talk with you again. What happens is for many people, especially people who are drawn to addiction in the first place, but especially pornography, is that their brains are running slow and fast at the same time. So in all the videos I make, I try to give a visual of this. It's too much slow speed theta and too much fast speed high beta. So theta is the biomarker for ADHD. And I'm definitely not saying that everybody who watches porn has ADHD, and I'll explain a little bit more in a second. But if your brain's running slow, if your brain is processing slow and using too much slow speed theta, that's associated with ADHD. And it also is created by watching too much pornography. So it's the brain pattern that needs stimulation. And if you're using too much fast speed, that's an anxious brain that also simultaneously needs to be calmed. So that is the brain pattern that's most at risk. Too much slow speed, too much fast speed. So anybody who has that in the first place is more at risk. But now this is the catch-22. When you enter the slippery slope of pornography use and addiction, it creates those brain patterns.
So I know you, with your scanning and what you guys do there, you can determine where these speeds are at. But if somebody listening to this wants to know, okay, like, am I somebody that's slow and fast at the same time? Like, are there personality traits? Are there things that in their life that they can kind of see? I know it's not going to be 100% perfect, but just to get a better kind of idea of, am I possible to fall into?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've already made one video on my YouTube channel, but I plan on making more videos to help people with that. And I made one video that says how to learn how to feel your brain.
Okay.
And so I'll tell you the symptoms that are most associated with those two patterns. The slow brain pattern is the biomarker for ADHD. So if you've been diagnosed with ADHD, if you have any learning challenges when you were younger, that's going to be the person who is easily distracted, has difficulty focusing. And this would be, you'd want to think about yourself prior to a lot of porn consumption, because porn will create that. So it becomes difficult to parse out. But, you know, if it's difficult to stay focused and anything like that, in terms of what happens is the brain's just running too slow that you can't stay on task. You're not highly productive. So like a lot of men that I work with, they will say, even before they started using a lot of porn, that, you know, they'd go to work, they'd be at work 8 hours. They wouldn't get any of their 8-hour work done. So they'd have to bring it home and still not get it done at home. Those would be some of those markers. Or like, I just talked to a gentleman who's like, you know, it's hard for me to get out of bed in the morning. And if a brain's running slow, it needs more sleep. Yeah. And it needs stimulation. It like literally, and so a lot of the behaviors that people have will be some of those self-stimulation behaviors too. So that, and that's the hyperactivity piece in ADHD. And it's difficult for some people to understand, but if your brain is running slow and it's basically trying to fall asleep by using this slow speed, if you use a lot of hyperactive behaviors of your body, like if you fidget and you can't sit still and it's difficult for you to just sit around for a few minutes, that could be because your brain needs a lot of stimulation. Now, this is the third most difficult factor because there's so many factors, but ADHD has a very high comorbidity rate with anxiety, meaning they mostly exist together. People with ADHD also have anxiety, but you can have anxiety alone. But anxiety becomes that mental stimulation. So a lot of people who have attention challenges might not have hyperactive behavior, but their mind spins. So over here, that extra fast speed is racing thoughts, hypervigilance. So always feeling like you have to be on red alert. And we know, as an aside, to go to this, to speak to this brain pattern, we know that at the root of pornography addiction many times is trauma or dysfunction in a young man's, we'll just leave it at a young man's because it's mostly men, in a young man's life. So what that can create is this hypervigilant, like you're always looking for the other shoe to drop. Rumination, constant thinking, or literally feelings of stress and anxiety. And I always call high beta this extra fast mode, problem seeking mode. So if you constantly see problems, and you know that plays out as anger issues, mood regulation issues. If you have a lot of problems in your life and you're attracting them to you, and then you can't deal with them, you're up here in high beta. And when we reduce these modes and we bump up perfect processing speed in the middle, like the exact same thing can happen to you and the world isn't falling apart because your brain's no longer in the mode of seeing all the problems and not the solutions.
God, I love this because as you're explaining each one of these, I'm like, yep, I remember that. I remember those feelings. I remember the anger, you know, anxiety, this, that. You said something of like when you're talking with your clients or your consultations, you know, let's think back to how you were pre-porn. Question, because, you know, I think the age is getting younger and younger and younger, probably as the days go by, because phones, devices, this, that. So how does porn impact the development of a child's brain? And if they maybe weren't born as, you know, somebody that was fast and slow, can it lead them to actually becoming that and
It
just
does.
what are the real harmful, dangers with young people?
Yeah, and
before the
you're
brain is fully
absolutely,
developed?
yeah, you're absolutely right. It used to be 11 and 12, now it's 8. First exposure 7 and 8. It's awful, but that's a soapbox for a different day. But so what happens is development of the brain performance pattern can be basically stopped at the age of first exposure. And it has to do with the trauma many times. And I don't even love using the word trauma because people think trauma doesn't apply to them because it feels like a big word. So I try, but it is trauma, but I try to use, that's why dysfunction feels better, because if I say, was your family dysfunctional, people be like, oh yeah, and be like, was there any trauma in your family? Oh no. But they can be one and the same. So
Yeah, that's amazing.
having something happen where then you're exposed to pornography at a very young age, and that becomes your mechanism of self-soothing the pattern that is beginning to brew because of trauma. So trauma can kind of bring those patterns out. But then going back to the idea of the 1 and 2 times of watching it in today's day and age of porn being on the internet and video, not like the Playboys of, years ago, is what happens is it can stunt the growing brain, because we know science shows that basically frequent and consistent consumption is shrinking the brain and lowering the brain activity. So that when that starts at a younger age, what would typically happen is, and there's a lot of working parts, but as a young child grows and goes through puberty, brains develop to the age of 28 in young men and 25 in women on average. And so basically that's, a lot of years that the brain isn't able to develop health in a healthy pattern because of the beginning of frequent and consistent consumption.
Okay. Now, I think you probably just perked up a lot of ears with listeners, knowing that we have, the majority of men, some of them in their, mid to late 20s and into their 30s, and for me, I'm 37 now. So I wasn't introduced to internet pornography at the age of 7, but once I was 15 and we had AOL, dial up, I can remember, closing the door and, finding it. But a lot of the guys that are, maybe a decade younger than me, it's like they've had access to this since they were young.
Yeah.
So when you were saying that, it literally stunts the growth of their brain. Here's these guys now that are hearing this, they're 25 to 30. They've been consuming it for 15 years. Have they been impacted forever, long term? Like, will their brain not grow beyond or develop beyond where it has, or is there light? Is there shining?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad you brought it up, because this is what I try to communicate to people. That's why I'm here. Is that neuroplasticity is shown to be able to be important and be able to be accomplished across the lifespan. And even I can remember even 15 years ago sitting in a conference where I was being taught, now maybe it was more than that, 20 years now, but I was being taught that the critical period of development was up to the age of 12. And, after 12, brains weren't that plastic. But now we know there's so much more research in the last 20 years that we know that brains are neuroplastic across the entire lifetime. And yes, it's easier to change a brain when it's younger because of a variety of factors, that the brain is younger, more pliable in and of itself, and the neural pathways haven't been burnt in for 10, 15, 20 years. So brains are more pliable when they're young. But I've worked with people at every age. And the oldest person in my practice, not for porn, but for different issues, is 86 years old with huge success. And so you can unwire. The way I talk about it is, what you need to do is unwire and rewire. And I always use visual. I don't know why. Probably because I've been a college professor for so long, and you're trying to use all the different teaching modalities, but we need to unwire the pattern. But more importantly, we need to rewire the optimal healthy pattern that can shift in and out of those modes. That can be accomplished for basically any person whose brain isn't injured, and that's probably for a different day, a brain that isn't injured at any age. With there's some work that needs to be done, but it can absolutely happen for everybody. So there's hope for every single person out there. And I work with so many people who have what's called learned helplessness because they've tried before and they haven't succeeded. They've worked with this, that, and the other professional, and that person hasn't been able to help them. And I like to tell people, communicate that unless you're unwiring and rewiring, if you're just counting on unwiring, that's not powerful enough. So if you just say, I'm not going to watch porn anymore, you're counting on unwiring to happen. And it may not, because for some people, it just doesn't happen. But if you're taking a proactive approach through training your brain, whether you use technology or not, and then using your body and your mind to rewire your brain, you're taking a proactive approach of rewiring in the optimal pattern and unwiring the less desirable one you've been wiring in. So with every consumption, you're wiring in the old pattern that you've had for the last 10 years. Stop doing that, start wiring in a new, better one, right off into the sunset.
You're speaking my language here. I've never heard or used the word unwiring, but I did a video on my YouTube, I think it was last week, maybe the week before, about, I don't know if you're familiar with like the no fap community. It's kind of like, we're just going to stay away from it. And it doesn't really seem to have a proactive approach. And I shot an entire video, like, it's just not going to work. Like if your plan to quit porn is simply, I'm going to stay away from it, good luck, because like, you're not taking that proactive approach. So let's kind of break each one of those down a little bit. Like what needs to be done on the unwiring side, obviously completely removing porn and not watching it is going to be one, but I'm assuming there's some other things that you can do to kind of help speed up that process. So let's talk about unwiring, and then let's talk about some strategies first without technology to rewire, and then let's get into the technology piece.
Totally, yeah, really, sounds great. And just so you know, it's called, there's a science behind everything that I tell you, and I always tell people, I'm just the messenger. But the science behind unwiring is called anti-Hebbian learning theory, Hebbian. And it goes back to Hebb's law. And most people have heard of Hebb's law, at least the adage. The unwiring is anti-Hebbian learning theory. The rewiring is called Hebb's law. Neurons that fire together wire together. So to speak to the unwiring, is neurons that don't fire together stop wiring together, is basically what we're talking about, but it's not powerful enough. But you do have to do that for sure, because if you're just going to continue to wire in this unhealthy brain pattern, you have no hope of being able to rewire in a new one, because that one's been being used for 20 years and you're still hardwiring it in. So strategies are abstinence of consuming pornography. And I can talk a lot more about the brain mechanisms that are behind that in just a second. But then also, and this is the part, talk about the no-fap community, because when I'm in one-on-one calls with people, I'm like, you're not going to want to hear this, but you have to stop masturbating. And they're like, are you sure? I'm like, yep, I'm totally sure. And it goes back to the neurochemical release that the brain is desiring to calm it and to stimulate it simultaneously. All goes back to the needs of the brain and what it's getting. So from pornography, it's getting a super normal stimulus. And this is why I say it's the first or the second time, because your body wants to be at homeostasis. Your brain wants to be at its optimal pattern. It wants to. That's why your body will heal. If you don't block it by using negative habits and behaviors, your brain will be at the optimal pattern for most of us. So then what happens is you have to be able to undo that and, try to use the optimal pattern. What happens when you watch pornography is you're dumping the super normal stimulus on the first time. This is what I was going to say. On the first time when you're watching, that homeostasis happens and your brain will recalibrate because it just got a double dump of dopamine and noradrenaline and oxytocin and prolactin, all these hormones and neurotransmitters being dumped into your brain like never before, because it can't happen in nature. But so then your brain goes, whoa, that was a lot. I need to calibrate for this. And, I'm going to equalize this. Then when you go back for the second time, it's had that double dump and it's like, I know this, so I've equalized this. So now the stimulus gives you a quadruple dump of those neurochemicals. That's why it's called a super normal stimulus. It's more neurotransmitter release than you could get anywhere in nature. But then of course there's tolerance too. So the more you consume, the brain's always calibrating. So you always need more and more and more. You need more quantity, you need more frequency, you need more intensity. And that is why I call it a slippery slope. So by the second time your brain's recalibrated, that it will get hooked to needing to come back to more and more and more just to exist.
Wow. Okay.
So when you stop watching, you're basically, and that's why people have withdrawals. And that's another huge question that people ask me all the time. Like, how do I avoid withdrawals? You avoid them by rewiring the brain simultaneously, because as you start unwiring, the brain's going, I always call it the Kool-Aid. Where's my Kool-Aid? Like, where's that awesome cocktail that makes my brain feel pleasure? And most men don't like to hear this, but it's really, if it's a frequent and consistent habit, and I also don't love using the word addiction, but if it's a frequent and consistent habit, you're using it for pain reduction. It's not just pleasure, because everybody thinks it's just my little habit to just chill out and relax. No, it's not. You're using it to soothe pain. And there's opioid types of neurotransmitters, literally pain reduction neurotransmitters being released. So it's like you've developed a substance addiction. Just the substances are coming from your brain.
We'll have all of Trish's links and websites and all of your courses and programs plugged down there in the show notes for you guys. We highly recommend checking her work out, fully supported and endorsed. Don't see anything here as a competitor, right? Like you and I are aiming at the same mission, which is eradicating the world of pornography addiction.
And that's why I don't. It's not like go to my program. I just want people to know, like, it really does become such a tricky thing to get out of. Like, this is another reason that I'm pivoting into it more, because this is what keeps people stuck in porn, because they want to go be with their partner and they can't. And then it feels so messed up to them that inherently drives them back into the screen. So again, we know from science that more young people are preferring pornography, quote unquote, preferring pornography over to relationships. But again, they're not talking about the fact that they cannot become aroused with another human being. So when I talk to people, they tell me, this is the first time I've ever talked about this with anybody.
Yeah. How much of that is because it's so accessible? Like, I tell people all the time, like, I am grateful I was born in the 80s, and my introduction to pornography for the first 15 years was through paper. Right? Magazines. I was lucky if I caught a glimpse of Skinamax, which is on a fuzzy TV, right? You maybe see something a little slipping up in there. But it wasn't really until I was in my mid-20s like that we had internet streaming technology. So at that point, I'm older on in life. But the young men today, the guys that you and I are working with, is like 10 years old. They're seeing the most hardcore stuff. So they're developing these patterns. By the time maybe they even have an opportunity to be intimate with a woman, they've had hundreds, if not thousands of quote unquote sexual experiences with a screen. How much of that is leading into their preferring it, once again, air quotes here, preferring it over sex, right?
Massive amounts. Yeah. That is the problem right there. Porn in your pocket, and early exposure. Basically, like I always say, porn has you by the brain. You don't know it. Like, you think it has you by the brain. Like, it immediately, even if you don't want to, it's highly addictive. It's a dopamine dependency. So like, it yanks you by the brain, and then it becomes the thing you go back to for mood regulation. But then it informs your sexuality. And we know this. I just made a video on how they call it your sex map. And, again, when I read the research, it like breaks my heart, and it makes me want to make 1,000 videos, because I want people to either pivot out of porn fast or just avoid it. Because what this study shows is once you've done that, your sex map has changed forever. Like, forever in quotes is what they say. It's very difficult to change your sex map back after you keep reinforcing it over and over and over. And that's what I find. I call it an arousal template, and some people call it fetishes. But, typically what happens is the thing that you found when you found porn, whether it be whatever, doesn't matter what the act is, what the genre, the thing that gave you the most dopamine becomes the thing that then you want to continue to consume in porn or to attempt to experience in your life. So, and just one other thing too, is that, all the developers of porn sites and of social media, they're not dumb. They know exactly what they're doing. The seeking and searching behavior is part of dopamine dependency. So they call dopamine the molecule of more, motivation, and pleasure. So basically, it motivates you back for more of what gave you the highest amount of pleasure. But the seeking and searching actually gives people a lot of dopamine. Like even on Netflix or streaming services, it's set up for you to troll for like 20 minutes. Like, they're not done. And even just, scrolling's the new smoking. If you look that up, a lot of people, I've made some videos on that, but a lot of people will say scrolling's the new smoking. And just like smoking, it took about 50 years for people to believe that smoking was bad for them, even though inherently it's obvious that smoking's not good for you. But it's so addictive, it was difficult for people to stop.
Yeah, I have a talk I give to parents regularly. It's kind of social media danger and how to kind of regulate it with your teens. And two advertisements I will always pull up in that, I'll use them through the presentation is smoking from the 50s, the doctor prescribed cigarette for pregnant women, and then cocaine, cough drops from like the late 1800s, where cough drops were literally laced with cocaine. It's like here we thought back then that these were good things. The science catches up to it, but oftentimes it takes pioneers like you and I and people that are, educating outside of, the institutions, and then eventually we'll catch up. And I think that's where the optimist in me like believes that and I've seen it, right, in 5 years. I'm sure you have since you've really become vocal with this, like the change in people understanding, the change in awareness with all these things, but we still got to continue to drive, right?
Yeah, it's beautiful because people are like, why don't you take down the institution? I'm like, I'm not even inspired to go towards taking down any institution, because and actually I looked up all the research on smoking because I found it fascinating, the parallel, because I know they're already saying, like scientists are already saying this is going to develop just like smoking did. And I looked up what made people stop smoking. I looked up scientific studies, not, blog posts or anything. And there were basically, a handful of factors that, first of all, they became aware of the dangers and that it could cause cancer. So I made a video on this about porn, is that when people know that porn causes ED, that's like equating, the fact that cigarettes cause cancer. Like cancer was a thing that made people stop smoking. ED is going to be a thing that makes people stop watching porn. It is a driving force. Another factor was the level of how addictive smoking was. So once studies came out and once people actually bought into the idea smoking's addictive, then they're like, I don't want an addiction. And then they try and it's difficult to quit. So they know they're addicted. So addiction was another marker. And the third one was secondhand smoke. So, which I think is such a cool parallel to porn, because people also don't realize how much it's impacting their relationships, especially like when it gets to a certain point, that tipping point, that straw that broke the camel's back. What happens is then, they'll have difficulty in their primary relationship with their partner. We know there's more than a 50% divorce and breakup rate when porn's in the mix, opposed to relationships that don't have porn. We know that it impacts children. And a lot of the people I work with are estranged from their children because their children found out about their porn habit and the kids don't want anything to do with them. Or it's changed the person, the person who is addicted to porn, because they interact in a hypersexual way, which makes them, like my friends will joke that they have porndar or porn radar, because now, like if we're talking with someone and they're just so overly sexual, they can't stop talking about the things that they're thinking about. So that really impacts. So I thought that was really interesting. Cancer, addiction, and secondhand smoke, which is likened to ED, porn super addictive, and it's impacting and ruining your relationships
And your families. Yeah. This sexual mapping conversation is fascinating to me. And I think it solidifies some somewhat controversial statements that I've made. We use social media, understanding polarizing, quotes every once in a while will help you gain some traction. I made a bold statement. I've done it a couple times now, and I got some pushback. I get a lot of support, some pushback, that pornography is fueling the rise in both pedophilia and transgenderism, right? And when you look at kind of the data in the search studies out there, teen for decades or for years has been at the top of the charts. And last year, Pornhub came out and said that they had an initiative to push transgender pornography to change the sexual orientation of men. And I think what you're proving through science is when you begin to consume these things, this becomes your regular default desires or what you want to seek after.
Yes. And sexual violence too. Like we can't forget that. So like I've made bold statements like that too. And actually, I put a couple new ones out, which I can share with you in a minute, that I'm like, this is going to get a ton of hate, but it's based on science. So don't shoot the messenger. That's what I tell people. Like, you and I are here having the courage to tell people the things they don't want to hear. It takes courage to do that. And, every once in a while, I have to get back in my blue chair and go, are you still doing this, sister? Yeah, yeah. Get out there and tell people what they need to hear. So like the idea is that, and the reason I made like the face while you were talking is because I talk to people about this stuff all the time. So we know the science, but anecdotally, my heart breaks for people who are so confused about their sexual orientation and what they like because they've consumed this, that, and the other thing for so long. It is creating so much heartache for people. And there's one thing about transgender people who have known that and they want that. But then especially, like there's people who are like, I have no idea what I want. And all I know is I know that impacted me. And, they're like, and actually some of the people I work with, they try to be with the same sex partner and they're like, no, but they think they want to because of the high levels of dopamine. So like for men who are watching porn and you're watching men, you're getting a high level of dopamine from watching the males, not only the females, but the males. So it is creating a lot of same-sex attraction. We know that for sure. And, there's a type of OCD, which, this stuff, there's only a couple things that chap my arse, and these are a few of them, is that like, talking about homosexual OCD being obsessive compulsive disorder. So there's a classification now with no talk of porn's influence in that. So like now they're just saying randomly for no reason, a whole lot of people are having OCD about being with the same sex. Like that is coming from somewhere. Again, just think about this stuff logically. Once you know some of this information, like high dopamine levels from watching the same sex in highly stimulating sexual experiences. It's about the brain. It's about dopamine. It's not even about the same sex. It's a dopamine dependency linked to whatever thing you are watching, whether that be children, whether that be violence, whether that be same sex. Again, I work with people who are physically ill because they can't stop watching too young of images. They are sick with themselves, but they can't stop.
Staying on that technology piece, I put a video up today, how social media is keeping you addicted to porn. You talk about that supernormal stimulus. Like with Instagram, we can just keep scrolling. And although it may not be the hardcore, stuff that we're watching on a Pornhub or tube sites, I gotta imagine that it's giving you that same kind of false sense of dopamine.
I came up with the term. I looked it up. Nobody's using it. I'm like, I should trademark this, but because someone's like, yeah, that's cool. I never heard of it that way. I call that dopamine dripping. So it's kind of like edging. This is the way that I describe edging and dopamine dripping is they're the same, but different. So like my brain is down here because thank God it's fairly regulated. So this is the dopamine levels that I need to exist and have a happy life down here. But if I had a pornography habit, I would need it up here to just feel okay about life. Then if I'm edging, what I'm doing is I'm going from 3 to 4, all in one session, to 5 across days, to 6. I'm keeping my brain in this cloud. That's edging, like edging up these higher and higher dopamine levels. That's why it creates these massive problems for people because they're at this just enormously high levels of and constant, like keeping you in a cloud, the bubble, keeping your brain up there. When it comes to Instagram, it's at lower levels. It's not at 3 like pornography would be, but it's down at 2. But it's keeping you at 2, 2.5, 2 3/4. And so what happens is you're not flooding your brain, but you're dripping it with dopamine with levels of consistency that last long, especially people who get on Instagram and they're just trolling through a feed for an hour or two. So then what people tell me all the time is then I relapsed because I was on Instagram. I'm like, you just took your brain from 2 to 2.5 to 2 3/4. Your threshold is 3. You've been dangling your brain right below your threshold for an hour. What do you expect? It needs more because you've trained it to consistently need more and more and more dopamine. The way out is to train your brain to need and want and be happy with normal levels of neurochemicals that make you feel good, but don't give you instant gratification. Teach your brain to use executive function skills, to go out, set a goal, make smaller steps, start making them actionable, take those actions, reward your brain, and keep moving forward. But learning to exist down here at 0 to 1.
Yeah. And love that. Actually, I take my guys, we like week one, it's, call it a purge or house cleaning. I don't go, there's been sometimes I've gone and I've checked their account to see like, do they actually do what I told them to do? But it's like, either take Instagram off your phone for a short period of time and just completely reset it. Because most of them, like they're not marketing. I use Instagram as a business tool. There was a time where it served a different function for me, but where I'm at now, like I have very strict rules, but we actually go through and it's like, I need you to delete these pages of following. She's not a fitness influencer. No, she's a softcore porn star.
Yeah.
Let's call it
Exactly
what it truly is.
Do I have to get off Instagram? No, but you have to entirely change your feed. Fill it with motivational quotes.
Yep.
Fill it with people who inspire you. Find the things that you like. Make sure there's nothing triggering in it. Fill your feed with that. So, and I've been so busy, undoing some of my great habits. That's how I use it. Like normally I'll throw something motivational into my brain, late morning. And then while I'm chilling out in the evening, I motivate myself and inspire myself.
Now, just a slight change of direction here, and then I want to get back. But can that though cause a similar problem though? Like if you're becoming addicted to motivational quotes, so you're just scrolling and getting kind of the dopamine dripping with a different type of content. So you need to obviously be careful.
Yes and no, because like that wouldn't give you the levels of dopamine.
Got it. Okay.
Especially if your brain was conditioned to other bodies, to objectifying.
Got it. Okay.
Bodies. So like it's not going to give you anywhere near, but yeah, you can literally become addicted to anything. But most things in the world, and I just had this discussion with someone, they're like, it's like a food addiction. I'm like, no, because for most people, food doesn't create the same dopamine levels. But if you have the brain that has the genetic propensity for a food addiction, then yeah, food's the thing you have to monitor and self-regulate around. But for when we're talking about, screens and technology, that's not usually the case.
Yeah.
Let's so yes.
Yeah, with a little bit of time we have, let's if we can, let's dial in on addiction, because we've really had that word kind of thrown since the beginning. I don't like it. It's it's got all these things, but then you said, hey, let's address this. I think you used the word sleuthy, so I'd love to define that. But yeah, let's just get your take on addiction. Like, do you actually have a definition that you use? I don't, do you know Andrew Huberman out of Stanford? Are you familiar with his work? He's a neuroscientist. He runs Huberman Lab out there in Stanford, but he's got a beautiful definition of addiction. It's the narrowing of things that bring you pleasure is how he's defined it. So just curious, like how, like, can you just speak to addiction and then fill us in on what sleuthy means?
Yeah. And my definition is kind of the more classic definition, but I really like that because I agree with that, the narrowing of pleasure. But, I think that it's basically what I told you before. The difference between just a hobby and a compulsion is you have to do it. And so actually the definition between compulsion is the factor for me. It's like OCD, but it's different. Okay. Compulsion means you go back to it, even though at the end of the day, you don't want to, but you have to be able to feel okay. And that's the narrowing of pleasure. And like you said, and so many people tell me, so many people that I work with, they're like, at the end of it, I don't even know why I did it. It makes me feel bad. So if it actually is pleasure, then you don't feel bad at the end of it. And so that's why I say seemingly pleasure, because I don't even think it's actually pleasure. I think it's escaping and it's pain reduction. And people will argue with me on that. But like, if you love to play golf and you just play golf all the time, like, is it a golf addiction? It's giving your brain similar, like, dopamine, but if it's good for you and you're making a lifestyle out of it and you can balance it and you're not like blowing off work to go golfing, like, but at the end of the day, you love to golf and you get done with your round of golf and you're psyched with yourself because you just got to golf. That's very different than wasting 5 hours and being like, I could have just done something else with those 5 hours, and then having regret. And we know if people have guilt, But then the guilt is I did something wrong. Guilt shifts into shame, which is I am something bad. And shame perpetuates the cycle again. And so, and actually, there's a study that shows that moral incongruency can be one of the strongest ways to get someone to commit to change and to breaking the habit. But what happens to so many people is that what they're watching morally doesn't fit to what they would tell people in the world. So it creates dissonance in their psyche and the way that they're living their life, because they go out in the world and, want to be and show the world that they're one type of person, but then they're watching again, like it's not real. And most of it's very intense. And we know that it's objectifying bodies. And we know that many of the acts that people are watching are not ones of pleasure. So that's why at the end, people feel sick to themselves. They just spent their time doing that.
And that's that social anxiety, that fear of conversations, fear of being out there, because what happens if these people actually find out what I'm doing in my alone time? Real quick, I'll just share with you kind of my, big shift in my personal story, my personal transformation. You and I are here kind of from two different paths. Me, I'm a recovering porn addict. I guess I don't use that terminology a lot, but there's really no better way to truly define it. But for me, I was a public type figure. I mean, I had an online fitness business. I was putting content out on social media, but a lot of my fitness stuff was even geared towards becoming the best version of yourself. Like I use that terminology a lot. And a real breaking point in my life was when I looked in the mirror after, putting content out on a daily basis, telling people to overcome fear, step into your greatness. You can do all this, like all these, personal development terminologies, realizing like, Frank, you are a fraud. You are not even living your best life. You're not even, stepping into the greatest version of yourself. And it truly came a breaking point. It's like, okay, well, overcome this challenge, overcome this struggle. And then I think that's what led me to the podcast. I finally found freedom. I just need to put the story out into the world. And the first episode was 90 minutes of my transformation. And it's grown and evolved from there.
But it breaks you. That's what breaks the cycle. That's why I tell people, is there someone you can tell? Or they tell me, and that breaks the cycle enough. That's why the consultations are so important.
I actually had that. I had that as something I wanted to address with you. So can we actually, is there anything that the science shows about relationships in healing and how those are kind of integrated, like actually having, whether it's your partner or a tribe or, a fellowship of men, like having those from a rewiring standpoint? Is there anything that takes place in the brain?
Yeah, definitely. And that goes back to, so the way I talk about it is building intimacy. And there's multiple different ways. And depending upon if you look up the definition of intimacy, you'll find like 5 main types or 12 main types. But basically, it's like having spiritual intimacy, physical intimacy, emotional, mental. So you can find intimacy. And this is actually crucial for recovery, finding intimacy with your partner if you have one. And even if you do have one, with other people, with a tribe, that's why 12-step groups have groups. Like you have to get a group so that you have a group of people that you can become vulnerable with.
Yes.
And so for me, and I tell people this every time I talk with them, is that when you build intimacy with other people, you allow yourself to be vulnerable. You let people into the soft spaces that you're afraid to let most people into. But by becoming vulnerable, and you just said this, actually, you become invulnerable. It becomes your armor. Because if you allow yourself to open up to people, especially about a pornography habit, it no longer owns you. So you take that vulnerability, you share it with safe people. We should probably talk about that, but you share it with safe people, and then you become invulnerable because it no longer owns you. That's the way.
Yeah. So what would be an example of an unsafe person?
An unsafe person is someone who can't hear it. Someone who, they don't even have to do anything for you. They just have to be able to hear it and be there for you. So people who judge. And in one video I made recently, I tell, I'm talking to men when I make my videos. I say, do not judge yourself for this. And I wanted to say this to you before, but on my website, it says, you didn't create this. but this is your responsibility to take care of. And I believe that, because if your brain was hijacked, you didn't do this to yourself. If you have the genetic propensity, you lived a life of dysfunction or whatever, and then now your brain was hijacked, you didn't do this to yourself. But with great power comes great responsibility, which is why I'm doing psychoeducation on my channel, because that's part of epigenetics. So like linking it all together, that is how you get above it. But by creating connection, we are people, human beings are supposed to have connection. And so people think when they couple themselves to the screen, they're getting connection. But I have to tell you again, it's fake. It's not connection. It's isolation. So what they end up getting is isolation. So when you create connection in a group or with your partner, with your family, and you allow yourself to come back out, become vulnerable, let somebody in, that person has to be able to hear you, not try to fix you, and allow you to dump that out and then help you get the right help. Become a support system who's not fixing you, but supporting you in doing the things that you need to do. And you know this by helping people. People have to want to help themselves. And then the second thing I was going to say is like non-judgmental, not judging you for it, and then extending grace. I use the word grace, having, grace for the journey that you're walking in, and being able to support you, and, being that's safe. If somebody comes to me, I'm not going to try to fix them. I'm just going to help them problem solve what they can do with them, and be there behind them if in case they fall, or if they need a shoulder. And that is a safe person.
That's incredible. I love that you shared the grace. I'll share with you, I know that's probably the thing I struggle with the most, because I'm so responsibility, ownership, it's yours. You got to do it. You have it in you. Like, people is like, Frank, you got to give yourself a little bit more grace. Cause I tell people all the time, like, my videos, like, I think I'm talking to myself, like, and that's how I create content. I'm like, I know what it feels like to be on that other side. So every video is really a reminder to this guy, just to keep it, keep walking a straight line there. But yeah, I definitely struggle probably with some of that grace. So
yeah. And I think I told you, I started my videos talking to partners, because, and then my mentor, Dr. Doug Weiss, he's like, I'm pretty sure you're not vibing because you just have a spot in your heart for people who struggle with this. And most partners don't get that. Yeah. So then I unlisted all those old ones and I'm talking directly to people who struggle, because I just feel so bad. People whose brains have been hijacked, especially when it comes to pornography, but I've been wanting to help people reach their full potential. I see these brain patterns as blocking people, like going back to the rigid brain. And trauma brain's only part of it, because when you hardwire in these neural pathways by going back day in and day out to the screen, like you're hardwiring in a pattern that is dragging you down. It's like literally like a cinder block on your ankle. So I want people to know that you're self-sabotaging. Like, stop it. The world needs you. Find your purpose, become the one you here, and rock that out and have a fun time doing it. That is the way to live life, not being sucked back into seeming pleasure and pain reduction.
Yeah, I want every person, every listener, every follower of mine and yours to know that the world is a better, more beautiful place with you in it. We need you to step into what you were created for. We need you to step into your potential to make what we're all doing here together the fullest, most complete version of itself. Trish, yes. I absolutely love your heart so much. I mean, the fact that you've taken the time out here twice to speak with me, to share with our audience, when I know there's so many other things you could be doing here. So we're just so appreciative, and I absolutely love it.
No, it's really super important to me. My passion runs deep, and so I'm not going anywhere. So hopefully you and I'll keep talking over time.
I believe there's something much, much deeper here. And from some of the people I've spoken with, as I was, sharing that, I had you coming back on, they agree as well that there's something really massive that's going to come out of the two of us. I want to ask one more thing, and then we'll wrap it up. This is, once again, just been a jam-packed hour. Relapse, just speaking to guys that are maybe in your program, in mine, or doing this, by following our content, and are building their own tribe around them. If you struggle in relapse, in the first 30 days, what happens? How does it impact you? You go back to day one. Then if you're 6 months, free, then you have a slip and relapse. You got to go all the way back to day one. So you can just, talk on relapsing. How does it impact, and then where can guys kind of navigate it from
Definitely. There? And before I forget to talk about this, I'll talk about relapse in general. Going back to that commitment that we talked about, when we talk about slips and relapses, some people never make the mental commitment, and you can dopamine release without anything. So abstaining is one thing. So self-awareness is huge. And that commitment up front is the number one factor that will make you successful, because and it doesn't have to be perfect. And I'm going to talk about that neuroscientifically. It does not have to be a perfect journey. What is, right? But when you're committed and you can start building self-awareness, and you can start realizing when you're giving your brain what it used to need in the dopamine releases at higher levels, that is what we are changing. So we have to change the behaviors, whatever they might be, that is giving your brain that massive amount of neurochemicals. So some people change their behaviors, but actually they're really not changing their brain too much. And that's the concept in alcoholism of a dry drunk. You can not have, you could abstain from drinking for years and years and years, but your brain hasn't changed at all. It's craving alcohol. You're just doing a great job at abstaining. Actually, that taxes the nervous system significantly over time. And what it does is it creates an anxiety brain pattern in there. So you can abstain, but you're basically spinning your electrical, magnetic wheels twice, 3, 4 times harder than you need to, just keeping that habit at bay.
Yeah.
Now, the way to come out of the habit is to, like we've already said, change the system, change the behaviors and the thoughts. But if you have a slip, there's a difference between a slip and a relapse. A slip is a one-time, you slip backwards just a tiny bit. So like if you have been, abstaining for 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks later, you take a little slip back, the key is to learn from that slip, deconstruct it. What got you there?
Yep.
What was sleuthy about it? Because something sleuthy happened. Something tricked you into doing it again. Like literally, that's the truth. That's the slippery slope. So something has to be changed. If you don't change another thing, you're likely to slip again. The more times you slip, it leads to a full relapse, which is you're just back into your habit the way that it was before, whatever it looked like. So slips can be really, really powerful. It shows you where the holes are in your program and your plan. So when you set the intention to come out of this habit, there needs to be a plan. It can't just be, I'm not going to do this anymore. It has to be, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I'm going to put my phone over in the bathroom when I go to sleep. I'm going to not go down into my man cave after 10 p.m. I'm going to turn my computers around at work so they're visible to other people. Like that's a plan. Then if you have a slip and it's like, I didn't realize my lunchtime, it's an hour long and I eat in 15 minutes, which gets me 45 minutes of sitting around in my car by myself. I didn't realize that was a yellow zone or a red zone that was going to lead me to a slip. Now I realize it because I just had a slip, and now I'm only taking 15 minutes for lunch and then I'm going for a run, or, finding the holes, plugging the holes and moving forward. That can have huge power for people. And no, it doesn't move your brain back to day one. It moves your brain back to, day 13. And if you learn from it, you can move your brain far ahead in your recovery journey. It's
faster, because you're actually going to build a better plan that's not going to be able to be penetrated. I love that. I mean, so if someone has multiple slips, there's a problem with your program. It's like a football team. If defense keeps letting the other offense through, defense has a problem. That's why I always say the best plan is a strong offense, but you need to have a defense plan to pivot at the pivot points when you need to pivot. But if you have an offense plan, those pivot points are much fewer and farther between.
Final question. I know I've asked you a handful of times, but it's been a couple of years since we had you on the show. Trish, what would be your definition of living a superhuman life?
My definition of superhuman living, I'm not prepared for this either, but honestly, I'm intentionally trying to create it every day. So I can tell you what my lived experience is that every day I get to engage in the work that I love, that literally I get into flow state. I can see it in my own brain now. I'm dang, I am tapped in right now, which is a beautiful thing where the day flies by and I've had just like total engagement, but I've also had time with my people. I've also had time for the things that I love. Like, to me, superhuman living is flow state, where everything you do, like, time passes and you're just glad that you got to do all those things. You're glad you got a beautiful night's sleep. You're glad you got to hang out with your friends. You're glad you got to travel. And that looks different for all people, but flow state itself can be accomplished by all people. And I'm working every day to try to get there. So I think that, to me, is superhuman living.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Awesome answer. Trish, it's been an absolute honor. Guys, check out her work. Check out the previous episodes with her as well. She's been on twice before, still today, 250 episodes in, the top two of the top performing episodes of all time.
Beautiful.
So
Let's make it number 3, and then I'll be back.
We'll have you back next year for the launch of the book.
Great. Sounds cool.
Well.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
Yeah. We enjoy you guys. Share this one, rate, review, subscribe, do all that good stuff. We love you, and we'll see you in the next one.